Hello there, Homeschool Nolan here to help you navigate learning in the digital age. Today I'd like to talk to you about teaching U.S. history to second graders, starting with the Declaration of Independence. First of all, why second graders? Well, my own son happens to be in the second grade now. At least he would be if he were back in school. And history has always been one of my favorite subjects. So I asked myself, is now the right time to start teaching my kid about American history? When I was in school, I didn't start learning American history until the 5th grade. The 5th grade, it seems, is a good time to start teaching American history because that's when kids have already learned how to read and they're beginning to understand and grasp more abstract concepts and principles. But rather than wait until the 5th grade, I've decided as a homeschooling parent to go ahead and start teaching my son and his homeschool classmates American history. I've decided that now is a good time to teach American history for two important reasons. First, kids simply can't escape history being made today. Or shall I say, they can't escape the news and current events. This has certainly been a tumultuous year for our country and the whole world. A global pandemic, a heated presidential election, conversations about equality and social justice. In the past, it was easier to shelter our kids from the worries of the world. But now in this digital age, when most kids need to be connected constantly to laptops or tablets just for learning, it's increasingly difficult to keep our kids sheltered from the news. And if your kids are like mine, they frequently overhear adults talking about the news. Our kids can't escape the news. And the news to them can be just as interesting or sometimes even confusing or even just as upsetting. But in order to understand what is happening today, you need context of what has happened before. And that's why it's important for everyone to be knowledgeable about history. Only by understanding history will you be able to better explain to your kids why certain events are happening now. Now, why start with US or American history? Why not world history or European or Chinese history? Well, for me at least, I think the answer should be obvious. Well, we live in the United States. I believe every child should start by learning about the country they're growing up in. And therefore, the history of the United States is where I've chosen to start. For now, I'm focused on teaching American history because that's where we live. And a lot of the conversations and debates we see in the news are really, in my opinion, just a continuation of American history. Topics such as racism, capitalism, the Constitution, equality, and justice for all are all themes that have been a part of our history for over 2 centuries. So after deciding to start with American history, I then had to ask myself when to start. What year should I start teaching from? Should I start in the year 1492, when Christopher Columbus discovered a new world? Or should I start with 1619, when the first slaves were brought to the Virginia colony? Or how about the year after that, 1620, when the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock? When I learned American history in high school, I remember that American history in the textbooks generally started with Christopher Columbus in 1492. History was then taught from there in a chronological order. Makes sense, right? You should teach what happened before in order to understand how they influenced events afterwards. But in my case, I decided to start with the year 1776, the year the United States was founded. This doesn't mean we ignored all that happened before. In fact, we later did circle back and cover events before 1776. But I started with 1776 because that was the year the Declaration of Independence was signed, laying down the founding principles of this country. The Declaration of Independence, in my opinion, is the most profound pronouncement in American history. The ideas expressed in the Declaration are the result of centuries of observations about human nature and the record of governments throughout history before 1776. The Declaration lays down ideals about freedom and equality that this country has continued to struggle about in the years since then. If you examine the debates our country is struggling with today about equality, justice, freedom of speech, they all touch upon ideals laid down in the Declaration of Independence. Today, we continue to discuss whether we are meeting those ideals, or sometimes whether we even should try to meet them at all. This is why I believe every child growing up in America should start by learning about the Declaration of Independence, why it was written, and what it means for us today. So, what did I use to teach the Declaration of Independence to second graders? When I was in school, it was simple. We had history textbooks issued by the schools, and the teacher would usually stand in front of the classroom and give lessons based on the textbook. In fact, here's my old history textbook from high school, written by a couple of Stanford professors. I still read it today to refresh my knowledge of American history. Now, I couldn't find any U.S. history textbooks geared for second graders, so I had to find an alternative. I think one of the advantages of homeschooling is you don't have to be locked into a textbook from a standard curriculum. You can mix and match different textbooks and videos and other learning materials to suit your needs. Yes, by mixing different learning materials, you might lack some of the continuity that a single textbook provides. But you, as a homeschooling parent, now have the opportunity to provide that continuity as well as the creativity. So even though I didn't find any history textbooks geared for second graders, I did find this series of books called WhoHQ. You may have seen these series of books in your own local bookstore. I started with this book called What is the Declaration of Independence? This book is about 100 pages, and it comes with nice illustrations and photographs of a lot of historical figures. It's about 100 pages, and it's pretty easy read. And although it's ostensibly written for kids, I found that reading it as an adult, it provided a perfect summary and a refresh of the story of the Declaration of Independence, and it's something you can read in just about 1 hour. So after choosing this book, how did I go about teaching the Declaration of Independence to second graders? Well, I first read the book myself, and then I asked the kids to read it. And again, this book does a good job in telling both children and adults the story of the Declaration of Independence. Now, at first, I thought teaching history would be all about telling stories about what happened in the past. After all, kids like stories, right? But I quickly found out that teaching history, particularly for younger kids, is actually a great way to expand their vocabulary and teach them new vocabulary words. The Declaration of Independence is, of course, the story of how 13 British colonies declared their independence and created a new country. But in order to understand what that means, you need to understand the meaning of some important words first. Words like country, government, declaration, and independence. So to teach history, I first started by asking the kids to look up these words in a dictionary. And from that, we talked about the meaning of these words. We talked about the definition of the word country and how countries have governments, and how throughout history, Most countries have been ruled by kings and emperors who ruled for life and were not chosen by the people. We then talked about the word declaration and what declaring independence from a government really meant. In addition to learning new vocabulary words, history is also a great way to start teaching kids about geography. I used a children's map to show them what the original 13 colonies were, or where they were, and where Philadelphia is, and how the colonies were once divided into northern and southern states. This gave them perspective on just how large a country the United States has always been, particularly at a time when people traveled by horse. And of course, we talked about the most famous sentence in the Declaration. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This is the central and most famous part of the Declaration. For over 200 years, our country has had many debates over what it means and what it means to be equal. To me, all men are created equal means that no person has the inherent right to rule over another. You do not get to rule over another person as king or emperor just by being born. The next phrase, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. The Founding Fathers believed that our rights come from a Creator or God and not government. And because these rights exist outside government, government therefore has no right to either grant or take them away. This most famous sentence ends with the phrase, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That a government was created to help people achieve these goals is certainly unique in human history. These are all ideas that I believe second graders can understand. Now, it's also important to teach kids a more difficult topic, that these ideas are ideals that this country has not always been able to live up to. The most obvious example was, of course, the existence of slavery in the United States. I made it a great point to teach my kids that during our nation's founding, black people were held as slaves. In fact, many of our founding fathers, including Thomas Jefferson, who wrote most of the Declaration, were themselves slave owners. So how would a second grader be able to grasp this contradiction and apparent hypocrisy? Well, quite frankly, I don't think many adults have been able to reconcile this either. And that partly explains why this country has and continues to have heated debates over what the founding principles of this country really are and whether we are or even should try to live up to them. We are all humans, and we all have our own individual bias. And this can be a challenge when teaching history more than teaching any other subject. If you really love your country, the tendency will be to emphasize all the glorious parts of this country while glossing over some of the past injustices. If you feel the opposite about a country, the tendency may be to emphasize past injustices while de-emphasizing a lot of the good. A good history teacher, in my opinion, will do their best to make sure the students are aware of the different viewpoints and leave it up to them and help train them, as young as they may be, how they themselves may want to interpret the facts as they know it. I don't think anyone can know for sure what Thomas Jefferson was thinking of his slaves when he wrote the words, "All men are created equal." There is evidence to suggest that He instinctively knew slavery was wrong, but he did not make any serious attempt during his lifetime to give freedom to his own slaves. I am fairly confident, however, in saying that if Thomas Jefferson were alive today, that he most likely would not own slaves, nor would he support slavery. I am also not so sure that if any of us today, if any of us were born, say, 300 years ago as a white male and we inherited slaves from our grandfather, that we would have known for sure what the right thing would have been to do during that time. But that's all a part of studying and learning history. We can all agree on names and dates and events that happened in the past. But it's really up to each of us to interpret the best we can what people back then were probably thinking and what their true motivations were. And when we look at our world today, we can still look at decisions people made and what happened as a result of their choices and try our best to judge for ourselves if those situations still apply today. When we think of our founding fathers, men such as John Adams, Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, we may think of them as old men who came together and soberly and judiciously crafted the Declaration of Independence at Independence Hall on a warm summer day in Philadelphia. But the reality is, they too were bitterly divided. They were divided on the issue of slavery. They were divided on what kind of government they wanted to create. And they were divided on what kind of country the United States should be. So when we look at our own country today, and we see how divided we seem sometimes, we should teach our kids that they too can always look back at the past, at years like 1776, and try to learn how past leaders may have faced similar situations. It's not easy, but it's important that our kids, as citizens of our country, know what the principles, what this country is founded upon. To me, teaching history is all about helping our kids and our students know what happened in the past so they can better understand and, to the best of their ability, judge for themselves what is happening today. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.